Hey there folks, welcome to week 1. This is Evan from Codify. And let's go ahead and talk about some of the week 1 discussion material. Very first question, what is our template folder for? What is our template folder for? Well, let's just quickly review making our template folder. I'm going to create a new folder here. I'm just going to call it new template. Already got one on my desktop, so new template. Note real quick that there are no spaces between new and template. Okay, you do not want to use spaces in your folder or your file names if you are working in code. It will cause you grief down the road. If you absolutely need to have multiple words in the name of a file or folder, you're going to want to camel case it like this. Not like this, camel casing, in which the first letter of every successive word is capitalized. The very first letter of the entire file name or folder name is not. Okay, this is a really common practice for JavaScript, and that's not something you need to know, but it is a habit that we want to ingrain in you as early as possible. Camel casing. Okay, so I've created this folder called new template, and I'm using Sublime. If you're using Atom or an additional text editor, that's totally fine. The process is going to be the same. I'm just going to drag my folder on top of my Sublime Text 3 icon here. And this causes a project window to open like this. Okay. If you can't get it to open automatically by dragging your folder on top of the icon, simply go to File, Open Folder, and find the folder you wish to open. Now here on the left is my file structure, my file tree. Currently it's just one empty folder called new template. Well, I want to start by creating my index.html document. So I'm going to right click on it, select new file. I'm going to save it by hitting the shortcut Control S or Command S if you're on a Mac. And I'm going to save it as index.html. Index.html. Now on the left we can see index.html inside new template. And to get started with a bunch of boilerplate code, I can type in HTML, hit the tab button, and the document auto-populates with a couple of things. Okay, now I'll come back to what all of these are in a little bit. Next, I'm going to right-click on new template again on the root folder of the whole project. And this time I'm going to select new folder, not new file, new folder. And I'm going to name that folder CSS. Okay, so now inside new template we have a CSS folder and an index.html. Now I'm going to right click on my CSS folder, select new file, save it again, and call it main.css. Last thing that we need to do is connect these two documents. Okay, now just to be clear, inside of new template, we have only two things. Not three, two. When I open up new template, there is index and there is CSS. The third thing that you see in this file tree, main.css, is inside my CSS folder. Alright, it is 2 layers deep, whereas this is our root folder directory. Okay, now to connect these two documents, underneath this title element here, I'm going to create a link element that looks like this. Okay, you should have this exact link tag inside the head element of your index.html in order to connect these two documents for coding. If your link looks any different than this, something is wrong. If your file tree looks any different than this, something is wrong. If when you actually open your template folder in your Finder, your computer's Finder window, if you see more than 2 things right now, there's a problem. Once we're there, we want to create another new folder inside our root project directory and just call it img for images. Okay, so now we have 3 things inside our root directory and a 4th thing inside our CSS folder. This is our file structure. Index, CSS folder, image folder, all sitting next to each other in the root directory. If you go 1 layer deep, that's where you see main.css. If our site had any images, we'd see our images in here. This is going to be very, very important very, very soon, that your file structure is consistent and that you understand how it's set up. All right, so moving on. What is our template for? Well, now that I have my template and I'm happy with it, I'm going to close it. And every time that I need to start a new set of exercises and a new project or new practice, I'm going to do the following. I am not going to code into my template folder. I'm going to right-click on it. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to paste it. I'm going to rename it to something like Week 1 Discussion. And this will be the folder in which I code. Okay, so the template folder is our boilerplate copy. It gets us set up really fast, so we don't have to go through all of this. We don't have to connect the main.css. It's already done for us every time we start a new project or new set of exercises. And that is because we have copied our template, renamed it, and are using that renamed copy in which to code. Do not code in your template folder. Okay, now what's going on here? Excuse me. Well, this is the setup for an HTML document. This line 1, it tells the browser that this is an HTML document. It tells it how to read the following code. This is an opening HTML tag and a closing HTML tag. What that means is this whole thing is the HTML element. Opening tag, closing tag. Opening tag, closing tag. That means that inside our HTML element is one head element and one body element. Opening tag, closing tag, opening tag, closing tag, opening tag, closing tag. Okay? Our head typically contains information about our site which a user or visitor will not see. Things like the title, things like Stylesheet. Sometimes you'll see information about the author of a site inside the head. Information which a visitor will not see. The content of your site that you do want a visitor to see all needs to be inside of the body element. This is where we will code all of the things and elements and images and text that we want a visitor to our website to be able to see inside our body element, between our opening and closing body tags. All right, with that, let's get started. What role does HTML play in website development? What role does HTML play? Well, the way that we like to describe it, I'm going to open this page in browser. It's totally empty. The way that we like to describe it is HTML constitutes the bones of your website. The bones of your website. Okay, so it lays down the pieces. It lays down the stone. It lays down the foundation, the architecture. It creates the elements that we're dealing with. Let me copy this element a couple of times, this h1 element. And we have 3 of them. HTML is the architecture, the scaffolding. It lays down these elements and gets them ready for us to work with and style and move and do whatever we need. Okay? The order in which you add elements in your HTML document will reflect the order in which they will render in our web page. Okay? Top to bottom, this will be the first element to render. This will be the second element to render. This will be the third element to render. And this div element, it has rendered, but it has no content, it has no height, it has no color, no styling, there's nothing to see. To prove that it's there, though, I'm going to open up my inspector. And here in my Elements tab, I can highlight all of the elements existing on my page, including this empty div. See, so it's there. That 608 by 0 is its size, which means it has a width of 608 pixels and a height of 0. That's why there's nothing to see. But it's there. It has rendered. What role does CSS play in website development? CSS is what allows us to style our websites. It's what allows us to make our websites look the way that we want. So in the same metaphor, if HTML is the skeleton, main.css, CSS is the skin. CSS is the skin. So let's go ahead and select that div using what's called an element selector. We're going to talk all about selectors next week and the week after. It's a very important topic. But this is selecting my div in CSS. And now I'm going to style it a little bit. I'm going to give it a height of, say, 100 pixels. Save. Let's reload my page. Okay. Still can't see anything in that div, but look, now it has a height of 100 pixels. Reason why I can't see anything is because it's still empty. It still has no color. So how about we give it a border? Well, no, let's give it a background color of tomato. Tomato is a color, a value recognized by the browser. Background color is a CSS property. CSS property, value. Property, oops. Property, value. Property, value. Selector. Okay, so now I've given the div a height of 100 pixels and a background color of tomato. Well, what else can we do? Let me select my H1s, and I'll change their color to crimson. Okay. And let's also try something like text transform uppercase. Now they're all uppercase. You might ask, why didn't I just write them all in uppercase in my HTML? Well, I could. That would work. This is really just to show you that you can truly style any element any way you'd like with CSS. There's also no wrong way to use your CSS to style a site. As long as it looks the way that you'd like, works the way that you'd like, is functional, doesn't take forever to load, then it's a success. Okay? At this stage, there is no wrong answer. There's no wrong way to do anything. What are 3 ways to add CSS to your page? Well, there are, in fact, 3 ways. One is called via an external style sheet. An external style sheet. And that's exactly what we're doing here. We have our main.css, which is a separate file, and that contains all of our CSS code. and this CSS document has been linked to our HTML document using a link tag. Okay, this is an external style sheet. Then there's something called an internal style sheet. And an internal style sheet looks like this. There's a style tag, like in the head, and inside there's just regular old CSS. Okay, this is an internal style sheet. Finally, there is what's called inline styles. And inline styles is where you take the opening tag of an element, add a style attribute to it, and give it a value equal to regular old CSS properties and values. Oh, there it is. All right, so this is inline styles. Okay, notice that inline styles have overridden the style tag, or the internal style sheet, which has also overridden our external style sheet. And we'll get into that more in time, overriding previously written styles. But rule of thumb is never write an internal style sheet or inline styles. Never use inline styles, and never use internal style sheets. You will sometimes see internal style sheets, especially when you look at resources like W3 Schools. If you're looking up things on W3 Schools, you are liable to see internal style sheets. The only reason why you will see this is because W3 Schools wants you to see all of the code at the same time. It wants you to see the CSS and the HTML at the same time. Internal style sheets are only appropriate for demonstrations like that. So you will see them, but you should never write them. You should always use an external style sheet. All right. Why do we keep HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and images in separate files? Well, it's simply that it allows us to organize our code quite a bit. It allows us to organize our projects much more. It makes it easier to manage everything. It makes our code easier to read. As you can see, look how much cleaner our HTML sheet is without that internal style sheet or the inline styles on each element. We keep them in separate files and separate folders so that everything is nice and clean, contained, and easily managed. When should you comment your code? You should comment your code always, all the time. Whenever you're learning, whenever you see something new, you should come in and comment your code. This should be a comment. This causes all of the text to become uppercase, even if it's obvious. Even if it's something obvious like that. Apparently, tomato is a recognized color. Without this height, the div has a height of 0 and is invisible. You should comment your code constantly. Constantly, all the time. What is the shortcut to comment your code? Well, whether it's HTML or CSS, you're going to come into your code, write whatever you'd like this creates a heading 1 element. Once you have finished writing the comment that you want to write, you hit Control or Command if you're on a Mac, and /. Control / and this will turn a comment on or off. It's a very useful shortcut that can save you a lot of time. What's a tag? A tag is an HTML element, or at the very least part of an element. This is a div element. A div element is composed of 2 tags. This is the opening div tag. This is the closing div tag. This is our body element, which is comprised of an opening body tag and a closing body tag. Everything between the opening and closing body tag is said to be contained inside the element. Or, put another way, the body element is the parent to this div element, and the body element is the parent to each of these h1 elements. Each of these h1 elements is a child to the body element. Okay? That's a tag. What's a CSS property? Well, these are properties. Properties are styles, specific styles, which you can manipulate in CSS or assign value to in CSS, like color, text transform, font size, font family, width, height. Tags, anything contained between these angle brackets. CSS properties, styles, which we can manipulate in CSS. What's a value of a CSS property? Well, that's, for example, crimson, uppercase, tomato, 100 pixels. All of these are values. All of these are the values of their respective properties. What CSS properties can you use to change the size of an element? Well, the obvious, height. What happens if I change the width of this div? It has changed the width of the element. So height and width are two CSS properties that can easily be used to change the size of an element. They're not the only ones, but they're probably the most important for right now. What's the difference between margin and padding? What's the difference between margin and padding? Well, this comes down to something called the box model. I'm going to give this h1 in the middle here an ID of goodbye. And I'm going to select that h1 by its ID in CSS. And I'm going to give it a margin of 50 pixels and a padding of 30 pixels. Now, to us, it just looks like this h1 has jumped away from its neighbors. It has spaced out. But what you should do when learning about padding in the box model is open your inspector, highlight the element itself, and look at all the colors there. Okay, here in the Styles tab, we can see margin and padding at work. But if you scroll all the way down, we see this representation of the box model. Content, padding, border, which it doesn't have, and margin. If I hover over the element itself, I can see them all at the same time. The box model is crucial to understand. Okay, the difference between padding and margin is that margin pushes Margin pushes to the outside of an element. Padding pushes to the inside of an element. If that doesn't make sense, let me show you something by giving this element a border. Okay, so now this element has a border. Everything inside this element is contained within this border. Let's hover over it again and look at what's going on. Content and padding are both inside the border. So padding is quite literally like the padding in a box that you're sending through the mail. It's quite literally the bubble wrap or styrofoam that protects the content inside of it, or the cushioning along the sides of a jewelry box, or any number of examples along those lines. Shipping peanuts. Okay, the content of the element is what is literally contained between the two tags. In this case, it's just the text, goodbye, exclamation mark. The padding pushes that content away from the borders of the element itself. It makes the element fatter. It pushes the content deeper inward. And it does cause some visual space to be created. Margin, on the other hand, pushes away from itself. It pushes every other element away. It pushes against the sides of the window. It pushes neighbors away from it. And it creates more empty or negative space. The key is that padding is inside the element itself. If I give this element a background color, a background color of light gray, that light gray covers both the content and the padding. The padding is still inside the element. Content, padding, border, margin. This is the box model. And this is essential for establishing your layouts. Number 11. What's the difference between an ID and a class? Well, in HTML, this is an ID. This is a class. Both of these are HTML attributes. HTML attributes. HTML attributes always fall inside the opening tag of an element, and they always look like this. You'll have the attribute name followed by an equal sign, followed by a value contained in quotation marks. Okay, if you do not have those quotation marks, there's something wrong with your code. Your text editor will work with you to show you that there's something wrong in your code, but you always need those quotation marks. Okay, that should be something you should get used to seeing. You should get your eyes used to seeing. Now, a class is an attribute whose value can be given to an unlimited number of elements. Okay, in other words, at this point in time, all three of these H1 elements have a class of intro, and that is completely fine. IDs, however, are much more unique and specific. An ID, a unique ID like goodbye, can only be given to one element at a time in your HTML. This doesn't mean I cannot give IDs to my other H1s, but they must have different, unique values. Okay? There can be only one element with the ID of goodbye. There can be only one element with the ID of hello 1. There can only be one element with the ID of hello 2. But there can be 3, 5, 7, 10 elements with the class of intro. The other difference is in how we select elements by IDs and classes. When selecting an element by a unique ID in CSS, we use the hashtag symbol, followed by the name of the ID. When selecting elements by a class name, we use the dot or period symbol, followed by the class name. And never forget to save your documents. Notice up top how index.html, next to it is that little gray circle. That means that I have not saved my index.html. And that's why when I just reloaded my page, I didn't see those borders pop up. Okay, so that's the difference between a class and an ID. What does the following CSS selector select? Div.box. Div.box. Well, from the last question, we know that .box should select any element with the ID of box. Any element with the ID of box. But what happens if we add div to that selector, like this? Well, now we're telling the browser to specifically look for div elements with the class of box. Not any element with the class of box, but div elements with the class of box. Now, something that a tool that I would recommend is this CodePen. Okay, now this is something that I built a while back, but it is specifically for helping students learn how to think about CSS selectors and what they select. I'll often see students approach a selector like this and say, this is selecting the class of intro, or this is selecting the ID of goodbye. That's not true. That's not true. If I copy the selector, paste it in here, select interpret, then what this is selecting is the element with the ID of goodbye. It's not selecting the ID of goodbye, it's selecting the element with the ID of goodbye. What about .box? Any element with the class of box. How is that different from div.box? Well, now it's selecting any div element with the class of box. Okay, this is a very important distinction. Now, as I said, we're going to get much deeper into CSS selectors over the next 2 weeks. So I'm just trying to introduce different types of CSS selectors right now. But interpreting CSS selectors correctly is going to be incredibly important. Now, if you want to find the link to this CodePen, you will be able to find it in the helpful links section of the home page of codifyacademy.com/learn. Let's move on. How do you open the Google Developer Tools? Why do we use them? You open them by right-clicking on your page and selecting Inspect. Simple as that. And we've already seen how we use them. We can use them to isolate or select specific elements in our HTML. And that's in our Elements tab. And when we click on an element in the Styles tab, we're able to see all of the CSS, all of the properties and attributes which are applied, pardon me, not properties and attributes, properties and values which are applied to that element. And we can edit them. We can see how they're affecting our elements by checking and unchecking all of these properties. Note that any change I make in my Styles tab is not going to be carried over to the live code. I still need to say, hey, I like this change. I'm going to keep it. Then I need to go into my main.css file, find what I need to change, and change it in the hard code. How would you correct this tag? Take a second and try it on your own. Pause the video if you'd like. Tell me how you would correct this tag. The answer is 1. Stylesheet is missing that second quotation mark. There should be a quote there. And 2, the href or hyperlink reference attribute is not pointing to the correct place. We're not pointing towards main.css. We're pointing towards main.css inside of our CSS folder. This is a relative file path. It is extremely important to understand relative file paths. Okay, this is an unmarked treasure map given to our browser. And when our browser interprets this code, it's inside our index.html. And the way this treasure map works is it tells the browser where to go first, what landmark to look for, and then where to go from there. So in other words, actually we're in here now. In other words, we're starting from our index. We're starting from our index.html. So that hyperlink reference tells our browser to go from here, look for the CSS landmark. Look for CSS. Once you find it, go inside it. And once you're inside it, look for this. Okay? It is a relative file path, how to get from here, the index, to here. There is no long, intense, absolute file path like you have probably seen before if you have a lot of computer use under your belt. This is an absolute file path. That is not necessary. Okay, a relative file path is more like telling someone where to find the nearest coffee shop. You don't give them directions starting from Penn Station, New York. Now I'm in San Francisco, which makes that example all the more ridiculous. But you don't give them directions starting from Penn Station. You give them directions from where you're standing right now. So if we are at 535 Mission Street and someone wants to go to the nearest coffee shop, I tell them, go out the door, make a left. I don't say, go to 535 Mission Street, walk out to Mission Street, make a left until you hit First Street, then make another. I don't give them directions like that, which is the equivalent of an absolute file path. I simply tell them, go out the door, make a left, and you'll run into a Pete's or a Starbucks or whatever it is. I tell them what to look for as soon as they poke their head out the door of the building we're currently in. And that's the same way these relative file paths work. Okay. Number 15, how would you correct this tag? Take a second, pause the video, give it a try. But the way we correct this tag is, first of all, image elements are not written with IMAGE. They are instead written with IMG. That is the name of the tag that causes an image to load in your page. Secondly, images do not use href attributes like link tags or anchor tags. They use a source attribute. And this source is what we set to the relative file path that leads to our image. And the file path is going to look like this, smiley.png, assuming that's our image. Okay. Thirdly, that file path, that value for that attribute is again missing that second quotation mark. So this is a corrected image tag. Now, of course, you should also have an alt attribute. Every image should have an alt attribute. This is for accessibility, for people who are using screen readers, who are visually impaired. Accessibility also affects your website's score on Google with its search algorithm. Okay, this is a corrected image tag. Now, how would you correct this tag? Well, let's see what we're dealing with here. We have div class equals box div, just like that. Well, let me load this and actually see what renders. You can actually see class equals box printed on my web page because this is being read as content because it falls between the opening and closing tag. So to fix this, we need to move our angle bracket. That class attribute, any HTML attribute, needs to be inside the opening div tag, the opening element tag. How would you correct these tags? Let's see what we're dealing with. Div Okay, so this is what we're dealing with. The problem is we have opening div tag, opening button tag, closing div tag, closing button tag. What we need to do is move that closing div tag so it is outside of the closing button tag. Now we have a button that is contained inside of a div. You want to be careful to never mix up your opening and closing tags like that. You cannot close one element inside of another. Cannot do that. The browser will dramatically misread your code here. Either it's a div inside a button or a button inside of a div. In this case, both the opening and closing button tags need to be contained inside the parent div element. And finally, what will a user see on your web page if you use the following code? Let me get rid of all of the content of our body. And I'll simply create an anchor tag with an href equal to https://www.google.com closing anchor tag. So what will the user see? The answer is absolutely nothing. The reason is because our anchor has no content. It has no text. It has no image. It has no anything inside of it. An anchor is used to create a clickable link, but if there is nothing to click on, there's nothing to see. Okay, so all of your anchors need some kind of content that will be visible to the user. This is what a user needs to see and interact with between the opening anchor tag and the closing anchor tag.